Hey guys, tonight we sink into the flickering torchlight of a drafty stone hall where the smell of roasted meat mingles with the iron tang of fresh blood, and the crowd gathered is not entirely sure whether they're here to celebrate or to survive. Your feet ache from hours of standing in the press of bodies, and your eyes keep darting to the heavy oak doors, as if expecting something terrible to barge in. You are at the coronation feast of John of England, a man who has inherited not just a crown but a kingdom already teetering on the edge of disaster. And you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hall is loud, with clinking goblets and the murmur of forced cheer. You watch as John, short and broad-shouldered, sits under a canopy embroidered with golden lions, his crown slightly askew in a way that feels less charming than careless. This is a king who has spent years in the shadow of greater men. His father, Henry II, his brothers Richard the Lionheart and Geoffrey, and he's determined to prove he's not the runt of the litter. Unfortunately, his idea of proving himself involves tightening his grip on every coin and every throat in England. The first thing you notice is how the servants move quick, tense, eyes down. John has a reputation for sudden rages, and not the theatrical kind. You've heard the whispers. He once ordered a nobleman's son starved to death in a dungeon over a property dispute. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated warning or a simple act of cruelty, but the effect was the same. Fear stitched itself into the very fabric of his court. As the feast wears on, you catch wind of his policies. Taxes, always taxes. If a man dies, the king demands a fee before the widow can inherit. If a noble's land changes hands, the king demands another fee. If you want to hunt in the royal forest, that's a fee too. Bread in the market costs twice what it did last year, and the peasants are quietly furious. A mainstream historical fact is that John's relentless taxation and arbitrary justice were so resented that they directly led to the baronial rebellion and the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215. But here, in the hall tonight, none of that rebellion has happened yet. Instead, you see the seeds being sown in real time. John leans over to a trusted advisor, a man whose smirk could curdle milk, and murmurs something that makes the pair of them laugh. Across the table, another lord stiffens. You realize this king is not building bridges. He's setting them on fire and charging tolls to cross the ashes. The wine flows, but there's a tense undercurrent. John's relationship with the church is already souring. You overhear talk of the Archbishop of Canterbury dispute a quarrel that, in a few years, will see England placed under papal interdict, cutting off sacraments and church services to an entire nation. Imagine the collective panic when no one can legally marry, baptize, or bury their dead. And yet John, in his stubborn way, will refuse to budge until political necessity forces his hand. At one point, a minstrel begins a song in praise of Richard the Lionheart. The notes are still hanging in the air when John's hand tightens on his goblet. He forces a smile, but you can feel the temperature drop. Richard's legend looms large, and every comparison is unflattering. The king changes the subject by announcing a new levy for the ongoing war in France. A war, mind you, that's going badly, because John's military skill falls somewhere between clumsy and catastrophic. A quirky tidbit from the gossiping servants. John supposedly lost his crown jewels in quicksand while fleeing from French forces in 1216. Whether this was due to bad luck, poor planning, or a curse from some wronged baron's grandmother depends on who's telling the story, but it's the kind of mishap that fits perfectly into his reign, a blend of arrogance and calamity. You notice how he handles guests of lesser rank, coldly polite, but with an undercurrent of dismissal. The richer the guest, the warmer the smile. It's a political economy of attention, and John trades in it ruthlessly. The men who will one day force him to sign the Magna Carta are here tonight, quietly tallying grievances while pretending to enjoy the boar's head platter. Somewhere near the end of the feast, a messenger arrives with news from Normandy. Another castle lost. Another garrison surrendered. John's jaw tightens, but he waves it off as if he meant for this to happen. His eyes dart to the nobles watching him, and you can almost see the thought flicker behind them. Control the narrative, no matter the cost. Later, as the hall empties and you make your way through the torch-lit corridors, you pass a tapestry of John's ancestors. Henry II with his hawk-like gaze, Richard the Lionheart astride a horse, and then John, his image newly woven, but already with a face that seems to scowl at the viewer. You think about how history will remember him, and realize that the threads are already in place. His reign will be marked not just by political failure, but by personal contempt. People will hate the man as much as they hate the policies. When you finally step outside into the cold night, you hear a baron mutter under his breath about a charter that will remind the king who truly holds the power. You don't yet know it, but you've just overheard the first whisper of the Magna Carta, and John, oblivious, is still in the hall behind you, laughing too loudly at his own jokes, certain that his grip on the crown is unshakable. The truth is, his downfall will come not from a single grand betrayal, but from the steady accumulation of smaller ones, each tax, each insult, each execution without trial adding weight to the millstone around his neck. By the time the barons ride out with banners unfurled, demanding change, it will be too late for him to charm, bribe, or threaten his way back to safety. And you, standing here in the damp grass outside the great hall, can almost hear the distant scratch of quills on parchment, centuries later, writing his name into the roll call of medieval kings most despised. Not just for losing wars or draining treasuries, but for the particular, personal way he made everyone, commoner and noble alike, feel smaller in his presence. That might be the truest legacy of all. You step into the cold, crisp air of early morning Paris, the kind that stings your nose and makes your breath puff out in little clouds. The streets are hushed except for the sound of boots on cobblestone as royal guards march past, their armor glinting in the pale sunlight. You keep your head down. The banners above you ripple in the breeze, blue fields dotted with golden fleur-de-lis, and you know without question whose city this is. Philip IV of France, the man they call Le Bel, the Fair, though not for his sense of justice. No, the nickname refers only to his face, sharp-boned, symmetrical, almost unnervingly handsome, because in matters of law, morality and mercy, Philip is as cold and hard as the coin he loves to hoard. The year is 1307, and you can feel the weight of suspicion thick in the air. Philip's court is a place where enemies are manufactured daily, and friends are useful only until their pockets or their loyalty are empty. A mainstream historical fact. Philip IV was deeply in debt to the Knights Templar, a powerful military order that acted like a medieval bank, safeguarding treasure and lending enormous sums to monarchs. Philip had borrowed heavily to fund his wars with England and Flanders, and the ledgers were not in his favour. In the narrow lanes leading to the temple quarter, rumours swirl. Whispers of strange rites, secret oaths, and forbidden practices are passed from mouth to ear. You know the Templars have their enemies. Envy is a dangerous currency, but this feels orchestrated. It is. Philip's spies have been at work for months, gathering accusations like dry tinder. Historians still argue whether he truly believed the charges or simply needed a reason to destroy them and seize their wealth. You have your guess, and it's the same as most. The king's treasury is empty, and he intends to fill it in one decisive stroke. The morning sun hasn't yet reached its height when the arrests begin. Doors are smashed in, and armoured men drag Templars, some bewildered, some already resigned, into the street. You watch as the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, is taken under heavy guard, his face pale but steady. Philip's orders have been clear. This is to happen everywhere in France, on the same day, at the same hour, to ensure no warning can travel faster than his soldiers. It's a masterpiece of coordination and ruthlessness, the kind of move only a king who treats politics like a chessboard could conceive. Later, in the smoky gloom of the royal hall, You see Philip presiding over his ministers. He speaks in measured tones, his voice calm, his hands folded. The charges are read aloud. Heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, unnatural vices, an entire litany designed not just to destroy the Templars' credibility, but to make them untouchable even in memory. The nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knows that once Philip has proven he can erase an order as powerful as the Templars, no one else is safe. A quirky tidbit drifts to you from a clerk near the back. Philip once debased the coinage, reducing the silver content so severely that riots broke out in Paris. Bread sellers refused the new money. Markets turned chaotic, and Philip had to deploy troops just to restore order. The king's obsession with controlling the economy was so intense that he even manipulated church appointments to gain influence over the papacy itself, effectively moving it to Avignon in what would later be called the Babylonian captivity of the church. In the coming years, the Templars will be tortured into confessing crimes they never committed. Some will recant and burn for it. Others will cling to false confessions, hoping for mercy that never comes. You'll stand in a square one March day in 1314, watching Jacques de Molay tied to a stake. His voice carries over the crackle of flames as he proclaims his innocence and calls Philip to meet him before God within the year. You feel a shiver despite the heat. Philip doesn't flinch when the news reaches him, but the prophecy takes root in the court's gossip. True to de Molay's curse, or perhaps to the relentless turn of fate, Philip will be dead before that year ends. His legacy as much about the ruin he caused as the power he wielded. Tonight, though, in the golden glow of the palace's great hall, he seems invincible. Courtiers fawn, the wine flows, and the king's sharp gaze roams over the room like a hawk surveying its prey. He doesn't smile much, just a faint curl of the lips when a plan moves into place. And you, standing quietly near the tapestries, understand that the most dangerous kings are not the loud ones, but the ones who look at the world and see it as a ledger to be balanced. By the time you slip out into the chill night air, Paris feels different, emptier somehow. The Templars' commandery is dark, its gates locked. The city's heartbeat has changed, shifted to match the steady, calculating rhythm of a king who has no qualms about remaking the order of the world if it serves his debts and his pride. And though the streets are silent, you can almost hear the scratch of his quill in the royal chamber, totting up the day's gains, blind to the truth that history will one day count him not among France's great rulers, but among its most hated. The rain in London doesn't fall so much as it slides down from the grey sky in slow, cold sheets, soaking your cloak and turning the streets into sluggish streams. You trudge toward Westminster, where the court of Edward II of England sits uneasily under a roof that leaks in more ways than one. The wooden beams creak in the wind, and you can smell the damp in the rushes underfoot. Somewhere beyond these walls, discontent is simmering. Inside, it's already boiling over. Edward II, tall and well-built, has a face that might have been called handsome if it weren't so often set in a sullen pout. He has inherited his father Edward I's throne, but not his ferocity. A mainstream historical fact. Edward II is remembered less for governing wisely, and more for his disastrous favoritism, most infamously toward Piers Gaveston, a knight whose charm and insolence have turned England's barons into a pack of furious wolves. You slip into the great hall, as Edward lounges on a carved chair, not quite managing the commanding posture his father wore like armour. Gaveston sits nearby, in silks that would look more at home in Paris than in a kingdom at war with France. They laugh together, the sound a little too loud, a little too private, while the lords in attendance exchange dark glances. Historians still argue whether their bond was political, platonic, or romantic, but the effect was undeniable. It warped the entire balance of power in England. As petitions are read, Edward interrupts to grant Gaveston a lucrative title. Another one. You can almost feel the room tighten. The Earl of Warwick mutters to the Earl of Lancaster, and you catch the word traitor spat out like spoiled wine. The king doesn't notice, or pretends not to. Gaveston grins. A quirky tidbit. Edward II had an unusual passion for manual labour. He liked digging ditches, rowing boats, and working with masons, pastimes that baffled and embarrassed the nobility, who expected their king to be above such things. You imagine the court trying to picture their monarch in muddy boots, hauling stones, while the affairs of state languish. It would be funny if it weren't so costly. The political cost comes due soon enough. When war flares in Scotland, Edward marches north, but the campaign is a shambles. Supplies run short, discipline frays, and morale plummets. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce crushes the English army so thoroughly that you suspect the very ground remembers the defeat. You stand on that field, mud sucking at your boots, listening to the groans of the wounded as Edward flees with what's left of his pride. Back in London, Parliament is restless. The barons demand Gaveston's exile, and for a moment it seems Edward will comply. Gaveston departs, but somehow returns. Edward's loyalty to him is either admirable or suicidal, depending on who you ask. The king's stubbornness ensures the inevitable. Gaveston is captured by the barons and executed without trial. When Edward hears the news, his grief curdles into a thirst for revenge, and England descends into another round of civil conflict. In the months that follow, Edward replaces one favourite with another, the Despencer family, whose greed makes Gaveston look like a monk. Lands are seized, enemies are dispossessed, and the Queen herself, Isabella of France, begins to plot against her husband. You watch her eyes harden at court, a smile painted over contempt. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer will eventually topple Edward entirely. By 1326, the kingdom is exhausted. The economy staggers under the weight of failed wars and the plunder of the Despensers. The people mutter openly in the streets, and the nobility are sharpening their daggers figuratively and otherwise. When Isabella and Mortimer land in England with an army, Edward's support evaporates almost overnight. He flees, first to the Welsh border, then to a lonely outpost. But capture is inevitable. You stand in a damp cell in Kenilworth Castle as Edward, stripped of his crown, stares at the wall. His hands twitch in his lap. The man who once handed out titles like sweets now has nothing to give. The official record says he dies in captivity in 1327, but the manner of his death remains a shadowed corner of history. Some say it was murder, others that illness took him. The more lurid tales, like the infamous red-hot poker story, are almost certainly propaganda. Yet they cling to his legend like mildew on old stone. Walking away from Kenilworth, you can't help but think of how small his world became in the end. A king undone not by a single great enemy, but by his own blind devotion to the wrong people, and his refusal to see the storm clouds until they were right overhead. And somewhere in the drizzle, the ghosts of Bannockburn seem to laugh. The streets of Paris are hushed under a late summer sun, the kind of golden warmth that should make people linger in markets and laugh in taverns. Instead, they move quickly, eyes lowered, whispers tucked tightly into their scarves. You cross the Seine toward the royal palace, where a king sits in a chamber lined with silks and tapestries, yet fears the touch of his own courtiers. Charles VI of France, known in kinder moments as the well-beloved and in crueler times as the mad, has ruled since boyhood, and his reign has become a mirror, cracked in 1,000 places. You first saw him in his youth, a striking figure, tall and graceful, with an easy smile that made people believe he would be another golden ruler in the line of the Valois kings. A mainstream historical fact, Charles's early reign began with promise, guided by capable uncles and loyal advisors. But somewhere in his mid-20s, during a military campaign, his mind began to slip. The day it happened is still recounted in low voices. Riding through the forest with his knights, Charles suddenly turned on his own men, cutting them down in a frenzy before collapsing into unconsciousness. Historians still argue whether it was the onset of schizophrenia, epilepsy, or some unknown illness of the mind. But from that moment on, his sanity became a tide that could recede without warning. Now, as you enter the audience chamber, the air is thick with perfume and unease. Charles sits rigidly on his throne, his crown resting on the table beside him. Today, he believes he is made of glass, a delusion so persistent that he refuses to be touched, terrified he might shatter. Courtiers approach with exaggerated caution, bowing from a distance. Servants have padded the walls of his chamber. You notice the king's clothes are stitched with iron rods hidden in the seams, a peculiar invention meant to strengthen his fragile body. A quirky tidbit. During one lucid period, Charles ordered the city of Paris to host elaborate festivals, insisting that every tradesman decorate their shop fronts with flowers and banners. The result was a city awash in colour and music for weeks, a strange interlude of joy in a reign defined by instability. But joy never stayed long. The political cost of his illness is everywhere. Rival factions, the Monarchs and the Burgundians, vie for control, each claiming to act in the king's best interest. You watch the Duke of Burgundy whisper to a chamberlain, while across the room, an Armagnac envoy glares as if the mere sight of the Duke is poison. France's enemies, especially England, see opportunity. The 100 Years' War grinds on, with victories and losses traded like dice rolls in a dangerous game. One evening, the court hosts a masquerade ball to celebrate the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. The torches throw warm light across jewelled masks and silken gowns. But Charles's fragile reality can't bear even harmless spectacle. During a dance, a torch is brought too close to a group of masked dancers dressed in costumes of pitch and feathers. The fire leaps from one to another, and in the chaos, several die horribly. Charles survives, but the tragedy deepens the perception that misfortune follows wherever he goes. In quieter hours, you glimpse him in the gardens, speaking softly to the Queen or to no one at all. On good days, his old charm flickers. He asks after the health of servants, tells stories of hawking and hunting from his youth. On bad days, he forgets he is king, sometimes even forgets his own name. It is on those days that governance falls entirely into the hands of whichever faction can seize the moment. By 1415, the war with England reaches another critical point. You hear the news of Agincourt, a catastrophic defeat, arrive in Paris like a winter wind. Charles, in one of his vacant periods, does not react. The Queen's face hardens, and the court buzzes with rumours that she favours an alliance with the English to secure her own position. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 will disinherit Charles's own son, the Dauphin, in favour of England's Henry V. Whether Charles understood the terms when he sealed them is a question for the scholars, but you can see the resentment smouldering in the Dauphin's eyes even now. Walking away from the palace one evening, you pass a group of children playing in the dust. They chant a rhyme about the glass king who can't be touched, their laughter tinged with the kind of cruelty that comes naturally to those too young to know fear of politics. You glance back at the palace and wonder how many more days the kingdom can be ruled by a man who fears his own fragility more than any foreign enemy. Years from now, the chronicles will remember Charles VI not only for the wars and treaties that fractured France, but for the surreal image of a monarch who sat in gilded halls believing he might shatter like crystal. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth, that in some way the kingdom did break, just as he feared, piece by piece, until it could no longer be put back together. The streets of Prague smell of damp stone and chimney smoke, the Vltava river winding below like a silver ribbon under the pale sky. Bells echo from church towers as you make your way up toward the royal court of Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a king whose crown seems to weigh heavier on the kingdom than on his head. Merchants grumble in the markets, and even the taverns, usually thick with laughter, buzz instead with bitter mutters. In his youth, Wenceslaus seemed a promising ruler. Son of the formidable Emperor Charles IV, he inherited not just the Bohemian throne, but the title of King of the Romans, a stepping stone toward the Holy Roman Empire itself. A mainstream historical fact, his father had built Prague into a glittering political and cultural centre, but Wenceslaus lacked both the discipline and the hunger to maintain it. You first catch sight of him in the great hall, lounging in a carved chair, a goblet of wine in his hand, though it's barely midday. His eyes are half-lidded, his hair tousled in a way that suggests he's only just rolled out of bed. A clerk approaches with documents requiring his seal, But Wenceslaus waves him away, muttering something about later, before turning back to a hunting hound sprawled at his feet. The nobles watch in silence. Historians still argue whether his indifference to governance was the product of temperament, illness, or simple arrogance. But the result was clear. The realm drifted, lawless and restless. A quirky tidbit makes the rounds among the servants that the king once ordered a cask of fine wine brought with him on a hunting expedition, only to abandon the hunt entirely so he could drink by the riverbank. It's a harmless story, the kind of indulgence you might expect from any courtier, but when the man in question is the one holding the crown, it becomes an emblem of neglect. Meanwhile, unrest brews. Religious tensions simmer as the teachings of reformers like Jan Hus gain popularity. Instead of addressing these divisions, Wenceslaus spends more time feasting, drinking, and on occasion disappearing from court for days. His enemies, both within Bohemia and in the wider empire, seize the opportunity. By 1400, the situation has deteriorated enough that the prince-electors of the Holy Roman Empire lose patience. You're there when the news arrives. Wenceslaus has been formally deposed as King of the Romans, replaced by Rupert of the Palatinate. In the Great Hall, the king reacts not with outrage but with a shrug, as though losing one of the most prestigious titles in Christendom were an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. His reign in Bohemia becomes increasingly unstable. The nobility, frustrated by his inaction, resort to open defiance. At one point, he is even captured by rebellious lords, an extraordinary humiliation for a reigning monarch. He is released after swearing to govern more actively, but the promises last only as long as his next cup of wine. The tension reaches a breaking point when Jan Hus, the fiery preacher calling for church reform, is executed in 1415 during the Council of Constance. Though Wenceslaus did not order the execution, his failure to protect Hus enrages many of his subjects, feeding the flames of the Hussite movement. You stand in the marketplace as a crowd gathers, voices rising in anger. The name Wenceslaus spat like a curse. In his final years, the king retreats further from public life. He spends more time in his hunting lodges and country estates, avoiding Prague whenever unrest boils over. The city that once glowed with the light of his father's vision feels dimmed, as though the very stones have absorbed the weight of disappointment. One summer evening in 1419, as tensions reach their peak, you hear that Wenceslaus has collapsed after a fit of rage upon learning of a violent protest in Prague, the first defenestration, in which officials were thrown from the windows of the town hall. He dies shortly after, leaving a kingdom fractured and on the brink of war. As you walk away from the city, the bells toll in mourning, but the faces in the crowd are unreadable. Some weep, others smirk, and more than a few simply turn back to their work, as though the passing of the king changes nothing at all. And perhaps it doesn't, for in the ledger of history, Wenceslaus IV will be remembered less for what he did than for what he refused to do govern. The heat in Seville clings to your skin like a second shirt, heavy and insistent, as you step into the courtyard of the Alcazar. The scent of orange blossoms rides the air, but it can't mask the undercurrent of tension that seems to follow Peter I of Castile wherever he goes. His subjects have given him two nicknames, El Justiciero, the just, and El Cruel, the cruel, and which one you hear depends entirely on which side of his favour you stand. Spoiler, most people, sooner or later, end up on the wrong side. Peter is tall, with sharp features and an intense gaze that seems to pierce straight through you. In his youth, he was hailed as a decisive ruler, willing to stand against the entrenched power of the nobility. A mainstream historical fact, he executed corrupt officials and curbed noble privileges, acts that endeared him to commoners, but enraged the great houses of Castile. The thing about Peter's justice, though, is that it's delivered with the same sword he uses for vengeance. Today the court is gathered for a trial, or something like one. The accused is a nobleman charged with treason, and you quickly realize this isn't about evidence. Peter sits forward on his gilded chair, listening with a cold expression as witnesses speak. though you suspect he made up his mind long before they entered the hall. When the verdict comes death, it's delivered as casually as if he were ordering lunch. The noble's family isn't even allowed to plead for mercy. Historians still argue whether Peter's cruelty was necessity in a kingdom plagued by factional strife, or whether he simply took grim satisfaction in breaking those who crossed him. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, certainly leaned on the former argument, painting Peter as a tyrant to justify his own rebellion. A quirky tidbit floats around the palace servants. Peter was so superstitious that he kept an astrologer on constant retainer, consulting the stars before any major decision. Whether the stars approved or not, those decisions often left blood on the tiles. Civil war becomes a recurring feature of his reign. You march alongside his forces more than once, the banners of Castile fluttering overhead. The air in camp is taut. Peter inspires loyalty in some, fear in others, but rarely indifference. One campaign takes you deep into Andalusia, where Moorish allies fight beside Castilian troops against rival Christian factions. The shifting alliances are dizzying, and you can feel the old order crumbling. In 1366, Henry of Trastamara returns with French support, plunging the kingdom into open war. You witness the seesaw of power. Peter regains his throne, loses it again, regains it once more. At the Battle of Najera in 1367, English troops under the Black Prince fight for Peter, delivering him a temporary but decisive victory. The celebrations are short-lived. His inability to keep allies and his reliance on harsh reprisals push even friends away. 2 years later, in 1369, the final reckoning comes. You find yourself in the dim torchlight of a tent outside the city of Montiel, where Peter has been lured into a trap. Henry is waiting. The brothers face each other, no armies now, just two men whose hatred has been sharpened over years of betrayal. The fight is brutal but brief. Henry kills Peter with his own hand, ending a reign that, for all its talk of justice, left Castile drenched in both reform and revenge. Walking away from Montiel, you can still hear the clash of steel in your ears. You think about how a king can be both beloved and despised in equal measure, and how the line between the just and the cruel is sometimes nothing more than whose ox was gored. For Peter I, that line was crossed so many times that, by the end, history simply stopped bothering to separate the man from the blood on his crown. The North Sea wind hits like a slap as you step onto the dock at Copenhagen. Salt stings your lips, gulls wheel overhead, and ships creak at anchor in the harbour. On the quay, merchants mutter to one another in Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, 3 tongues bound uneasily together under one crown. That crown sits on the head of Eric of Pomerania, King of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Though if you listen to the traders, you'd think his real title is King of Making Our Lives Miserable. Eric's reign began with hope. Adopted by Queen Margaret I, he inherited her vision of the Kalmar Union, a unified Scandinavia capable of standing up to the Hanseatic League and other European powers. A mainstream historical fact. In the early years, Eric continued her policies, strengthening royal authority and trying to knit the kingdoms together. But somewhere along the way, ambition curdled into stubbornness and strategy into spite. You first see him in the royal hall, his tall frame draped in furs, eyes narrowed at a delegation of merchants. The Hanseatic traders complain of new tolls, tariffs, and shipping restrictions that choke commerce through the Øresund Strait. Eric listens, nods once, and then announces an increase in the fees. You can almost hear the collective groan ripple through the chamber. The toll, known as the Sound Dues, becomes his personal goldmine and the merchant's nightmare. Historians still argue whether Eric's hardline trade policy was a bold attempt to secure Scandinavian independence or simply a short-sighted cash grab. The result is the same. Trade collapses, piracy spikes, and foreign relations sour faster than a barrel of herring in July. A quirky tidbit floats among the dockhands. Eric had a penchant for disguises. He would sometimes wander marketplaces dressed as a commoner, eavesdropping on conversations to hear what his subjects truly thought of him. Unfortunately, the stories go, He rarely used this intel to improve their lot more often. It was a way to identify critics and quietly punish them. War with the Hanseatic League follows, draining the coffers and straining the fragile unity of the Kalmar Union. Swedish nobles, chafing under his rule, rise in rebellion. You ride north with his forces to suppress the uprisings. But the countryside feels sullen, the towns hostile. The Swedes call him a foreigner, Pomeranian by birth, and their resentment simmers into outright defiance. In Norway, unrest builds as well. The promise of a strong, prosperous union has given way to the reality of higher taxes, restricted trade, and a king who seems more interested in squeezing coin than in listening to grievances. The tension comes to a head in the 1432 when uprisings in Sweden, led by Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson, shake the union to its core. By 1439, the nobility of all three kingdoms have had enough. You're there when the Danish council strips Erik of his crown, citing mismanagement and endless conflict. Sweden and Norway follow suit. Erik doesn't go quietly, he retreats to Gotland, the island fortress in the Baltic, from which he continues to launch raids on shipping lanes like some royal pirate. Years later, you hear of his final exile to Pomerania, where he spends his remaining days far from the halls of Scandinavian power. Walking along the docks where you first arrived, the wind just as sharp, you realize the irony. Erik's dream was control of the seas, but his legacy is a coastline lined with enemies, a union fractured, and a reign remembered more for tolls and turmoil than for unity or peace. The wind coming off the Baltic carries the bite of salt and the tang of tar from the shipyards. You pull your cloak tighter as you walk toward the stone keep of Vordingborg, where King Valdemar IV of Denmark holds court. The guards at the gate shift their weight in the cold, their armor dulled from use. Inside, the air smells of beeswax and parchment, the faint scent of boiled fish drifting in from the kitchens. Valdemar, known as Atterdag, another day, is a man who believes any loss can be reclaimed, any humiliation avenged, if you're willing to squeeze your people hard enough to pay for it. When he took the throne in 1340, Denmark was a patchwork of debts and foreign occupations. A mainstream historical fact, Valdemar clawed back much of the kingdom piece by piece, buying or seizing territories from the German counts who had carved it up. In the early years, this determination made him look like a restorer of Danish pride. But rebuilding a kingdom requires more than grit, it requires gold. And that's where the story turns bitter. You see him in the council chamber, leaning over a map, his finger tracing the coasts and islands he intends to reclaim. His voice is calm but sharp as he outlines a new round of taxes, grain levies from farmers, harbour fees from fishermen, tolls on goods passing through market towns. The councillors glance at each other, some nodding in approval, others tightening their lips. You can almost hear the unspoken truth. This is going to hurt. Historians still argue whether these taxes were the inevitable price of Denmark's recovery or an overreach by a king who had come to see the treasury as his personal war chest. What's certain is that the burden fell hardest on peasants and townsfolk, whose patience wore thinner with each new demand. A quirky tidbit whispered among merchants. Valdemar once paid part of a ransom with barrels of butter. It sounds absurd, but in a medieval economy, butter was as good as coin in the right season. The story makes people laugh, but it also reminds them of the king's relentless knack for turning anything into revenue. His biggest gamble comes in 1361, when he launches an invasion of Gotland, capturing the wealthy town of Visby. You march with his troops through the city gates, past piles of merchant goods and church treasures now bound for Danish ships. The loot is staggering furs, silks, silver, all feeding the king's ambitions. But the raid provokes the Hanseatic League, whose fleets soon blockade Danish ports. The war drags on, trade slows to a trickle, and taxes climb higher still to fund the defence. In the countryside, farmers grumble over empty grain stores. In the cities, guild leaders mutter about rebellion. You stand in a tavern one night, listening as a merchant slams his cup on the table and swears he'd rather deal with the Germans than another year under Valdemar's tolls. By the mid-1372, the strain shows. Though Valdemar wins some concessions from his enemies, Denmark's economy limps and resentment runs deep. Even the nobility begin to balk, sensing that the king's drive for control leaves little room for their own power. Yet Valdemar never seems to doubt himself. In the Great Hall he toasts his victories, speaking of another day, as if time itself will keep handing him chances to win. When he dies in 1375, the court dresses in black, and official chronicles praise him as the saviour of Denmark. But beyond the palace walls, the grief is mixed with relief. Walking away from Vordingborg, you hear a farmer mutter to his son, "Maybe tomorrow will belong to us again." For all his conquests, Valdemar IV leaves behind a kingdom more united on paper than in spirit, and a people who will remember the taxes longer than the triumphs. The morning mist curls over the Danube like ghostly fingers as you arrive in Buda, the Hungarian capital, though the boy who wears its crown barely understands the weight of it. Ladislaus, the Posthumous, so called because he was born after his father's death, was thrust into royal titles before he could walk. King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia, Duke of Austria, all on paper, all before his first birthday. A crown in the cradle might sound poetic, but here it means years of being a pawn on someone else's chessboard. You catch sight of him for the first time in a sunlit courtyard. He's not yet a man thin, pale, with the delicate features of someone who has been sheltered more than shaped by the world. A mainstream historical fact. Ladislaus's early life was dominated by regents and guardians who fought each other for control of his realms. In Hungary, the fierce Hunyadi family claimed to defend his interests. In Austria, powerful nobles pulled him in the opposite direction. In Bohemia, the Hussite legacy still fueled factional tension. In the council chambers, Ladislaus sits quietly while older men argue. Their voices clash over alliances, taxes, troop movements. Occasionally, he glances at the papers before him, as if trying to remember whether his opinion would matter. The truth is, it doesn't, at least not yet. Every decision is filtered through whichever regent currently has him in their grip. Historians still argue whether Ladislaus ever had the temperament to rule on his own, or if the years of being handled like a valuable but fragile relic doomed him from the start. A quirky tidbit that circulates in the Austrian court: Ladislaus reportedly loved falconry, but his handlers often substituted tame birds, so there was no risk of the young king injuring himself or losing a prized hawk. Imagine trying to learn skill and daring, while your keepers insist on safety at every turn. It says more about his upbringing than any official chronicle. As the boy grows into a teenager, the world around him grows more dangerous. In 1456, Hungary faces the Ottoman advance, and John Hunyadi, the realm's greatest military commander, wins a stunning victory at the Siege of Belgrade. Yet instead of unity, the victory breeds suspicion. The Hunyadis are too popular, too powerful. Soon after, Ladislaus's court imprisons Hunyadi's son, Ladislaus, on dubious charges and executes him without trial. You're in the square when the sentence is carried out. The crowds shock like a physical force in the air. From that moment, the young king's fate is sealed. Many believe the execution was orchestrated by his advisors, but the blame settles on Ladislaus's shoulders. In Buda and Vienna alike, whispers of treachery follow him. His court becomes a fortress of paranoia, guarded against enemies both real and imagined. By 1457, Ladislaus is only 17, but the years of tension seem to have aged him. Then, abruptly, his story ends. He falls ill in Prague, some say of the plague, others of poison slipped into his wine by those avenging the Hunyadis. You stand in the dim candlelight of his chamber, watching the boy. King's shallow breaths fade, and it strikes you how quiet the room is. No generals, no statesmen, no grieving family, just the attendants, who seem more focused on what will happen after he's gone than on the fact he's going. When the bells toll for his death, the city reacts with a mix of mourning and political calculation. Walking away through the narrow streets, you realize Ladislaus's life was less a reign than an intermission between greater players. His name will survive in the ledgers, but his legacy will be that of a boy caught in the jaws of kingdoms, never given the chance to grow into his own crown. The bells of Pamplona toll in the clear mountain air, their sound tumbling down the narrow streets and over the tiled rooftops of Navarre. Merchants pull shutters closed before the midday sun hits full force. Somewhere up in the castle, Charles II of Navarre, called the Bad, is holding court, and the people in the square speak his nickname more often than his title. Charles II is not a large man, but he moves with the self-possession of someone who has never doubted his own cleverness. His eyes are sharp, his voice soft, and he has the disconcerting habit of smiling when others might frown. A mainstream historical fact. Charles spent his reign weaving alliances and betrayals in equal measure, playing France, England, and Castile against one another in the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. In some circles, he was admired for his cunning. In more, he was despised for his treachery. You first meet him at a council table cluttered with maps and letters, the wax seals still warm. His advisers debate whether to honor the latest treaty with France, but Charles leans back in his chair, already plotting how to break it. He speaks of opportunity. In the same tone, another man might speak of obligation. Historians still argue whether his shifting loyalties were a survival tactic for a small kingdom wedged between giants, or simply a reflection of his own appetite for intrigue. What's clear is that he thrived in chaos. When England gained the upper hand, he offered troops. When France rallied, he pledged loyalty there instead. It was less about serving Navarre's interests than about keeping Charles himself indispensable to all sides. A quirky tidbit the kitchen servants whisper about. Charles kept exotic animals in the palace gardens, peacocks, a leopard, even a pair of Barbary apes, gifts from foreign courts meant to flatter him. He enjoyed walking among them in the evenings, as though parading proof of his global connections. But rumour has it he once traded the leopard for a chest of silver when his war fund ran low. Navarre's position between France and Spain makes it a prize worth fighting over, and Charles plays the part of host to visiting dignitaries with disarming charm. You watch him pour wine for a French envoy in the afternoon, then slip away after nightfall to meet an English captain in a candlelit chamber. He speaks softly, never promising more than he can deny later. But duplicity has its cost. His own nobles begin to doubt his word, especially after he levies heavy taxes to fund schemes that rarely benefit Navarre itself. One winter, famine strikes, and instead of easing the burden, Charles diverts grain to secure military favours abroad. You walk the streets and see bread prices triple, while the royal kitchens stay busy. In 1356, his appetite for plots takes a darker turn. Suspected of involvement in the assassination of a French noble, Charles is arrested by King John II of France. His imprisonment is a public humiliation, and yet true to form he negotiates his release within a year, returning to Navarre with his pride intact and his reputation for ruthlessness only deepened. Over the decades, the cycle repeats. Alliance, betrayal, reconciliation. His foreign entanglements pull Navarre into conflicts it can scarcely afford. You travel with his retinue during one of his absences from the kingdom, and see firsthand how much of governance is left to deputies who lack the king's guile but excel at self-enrichment. The end, when it comes, is not in battle or in intrigue but in a strange accident. In 1387, afflicted with illness and possibly gangrene, Charles is treated with brandy-soaked bandages to stimulate circulation. One night, a careless attendant lets the cloths catch fire. You hear the commotion, the shouting, the frantic rush to smother the flames. The king survives the initial burns but dies soon after. Whether from the injuries or from the shock, no one is certain. As his body lies in state, courtiers file past, faces schooled into grief but eyes betraying calculation. Navarre will move on. France and Castile will continue their dance of war and diplomacy. Charles II will be remembered as a man who made betrayal an art form, who spoke loyalty as if it were currency to be spent, not a bond to be kept. Walking away from the castle into the bright mountain air, you think about how some rulers are hated for cruelty, others for incompetence. Charles of Navarre managed to be hated for being too clever, a king who could never resist the temptation to play every side even when the game burned down around him. The morning fog in Tours clings low to the Loire River, rolling slowly past stone bridges and shuttered houses. You step into the courtyard of a fortress that hums with quiet menace. Inside, Louis XI of France, known as l'Universel Araigne, the universal spider, is already at work in his web. His thin frame is wrapped in a simple hooded cloak, an almost monkish habit that hides the sharpest political instincts in Europe. At first glance, Louis does not look like the kings in illuminated manuscripts. There's no grand armor, no bejeweled crown. He prefers comfort over display felt hats, soft shoes, clothes that let him move quickly through narrow corridors. A mainstream historical fact: his reign from 1461 to 1483 strengthened the French monarchy after decades of war, but his methods, bribes, blackmail, and ruthless manipulation earned him as many enemies as victories. You see him in the council chamber, seated at a long oak table scattered with letters and sealed messages. A servant reads aloud an intercepted missive from a Burgundian envoy. Louis interrupts, already reciting the contents from memory. He has spies everywhere, in noble households, in taverns, even in monasteries, and he remembers everything. His soft voice makes the information sound almost harmless, until you realize he's mapping out who will live, who will be ruined, and who will disappear quietly before winter ends. Historians still argue whether Louis's web of espionage was a defensive necessity in a fragile kingdom, or a compulsive habit born from paranoia. In practice, it was both. A quirky tidbit that ripples through court gossip. Louis XI adored mechanical trinkets and kept a collection of odd gadgets, clockwork birds, miniature siege engines, even a tiny folding crossbow. He would sometimes demonstrate them during tense meetings, as if reminding his guests that the smallest tools can be the deadliest. His relationship with the nobility is a study in controlled hostility. Instead of grand confrontations, Louis prefers to lure enemies into agreements they can't keep, then pounce when they falter. The powerful Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, is his greatest rival, and their rivalry plays out like a prolonged chess match. You watch Louis quietly fund Burgundian rebels, then deny any involvement with a saintly shrug. Not all of his battles are fought with coin and contracts. In 1477, Charles the Bold dies at the Battle of Nancy, and Louis wastes no time seizing Burgundy's territories. You travel with his forces as they move into the duchy, the king himself riding under a plain banner, avoiding the pomp of a conqueror. His victory is not greeted with cheers from the locals, but it cements France's expansion and his own grip on power. For commoners, Louis is an enigma. He reduces certain taxes and promotes trade, yet his justice is swift and often merciless. A merchant accused of fraud might find himself hanged without the benefit of a lengthy trial. Peasants mutter blessings and curses in the same breath. In the final years of his reign, the king retreats more and more to Plessis-les-Tours, his favorite fortified residence. You walk its narrow halls lined with armed guards and iron grills over the windows. The fortress feels more like a prison, one of his own making, than a royal palace. Some say he fears assassination, others that he simply likes to be surrounded by walls as thick as his mistrust. In private, Louis shows flashes of sentimentality. You once glimpse him feeding pigeons in the courtyard, murmuring to them as if they were confidants. Moments later, he's dictating a letter that will ruin a noble family's fortunes for siding with Burgundy 2 decades earlier. The switch from tenderness to cold calculation is seamless. When illness begins to sap his strength, Louis becomes even more secretive. He refuses to see certain courtiers, communicates through trusted intermediaries, and guards state secrets as if they were his own breath. In August 1483, he dies, leaving the throne to his son, Charles VIII, a boy of 13. The web, for the moment, collapses without its spider. As you step out into the damp air along the Loire, you can almost feel the ghost of Louis's gaze, weighing you, measuring you, deciding if you're worth a thread in his design. History will remember him as a king who built France's strength on a foundation of fear and favours, a ruler who understood that power is not about who shouts loudest, but about who listens longest and never forgets what they hear. The spring air in Buda smells of wet earth and smoke from the river barges. Church bells mingle with the cries of vendors selling dried fish, their voices echoing off the castle walls. Inside those walls, King Sigismund of Hungary sits on a carved chair under a painted ceiling, looking every inch the confident monarch until you start to notice how often his attention drifts toward the door, as if gauging whether someone might burst in with bad news. Sigismund's reign is a long one. He will rule Hungary for nearly half a century, become King of Germany, King of Bohemia, and even Holy Roman Emperor. But here, early in his story, his crown feels less like a badge of honor and more like a helmet in a battlefield he doesn't quite understand. A mainstream historical fact. In 1396, he led the Christian coalition against the Ottomans at the Battle of Nicopolis, a campaign meant to be a glorious crusade. Instead, it became one of the most humiliating defeats in medieval Europe. You're with his army as it marches south through the Balkans. The ranks are swollen with knights from France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire, men in glittering armor with banners flapping like jeweled wings. They swagger in camp, boasting of the spoils to come. Sigismund tries to play host and commander at once, but the coalition is a mess. Languages clash, rivalries simmer, and strategies are argued over in tents until the candles burn low. Historians still argue whether Sigismund's greatest failure was his own overconfidence or his inability to rein in his allies. The French knights, eager for glory, push for a headlong assault at Nicopolis despite the king's warnings. On the day of battle, you watch in disbelief as they charge uphill into the Ottoman vanguard, only to be cut down or captured in the trap that follows. Sigismund's own forces break soon after. By nightfall, the crusading army is shattered. The king flees downriver to the Black Sea, barely escaping capture. His retreat will haunt his reputation for years. A quirky tidbit whispered in the Hungarian court. Sigismund loved brightly patterned clothes, especially those with extravagant slashes in the sleeves and legs to reveal contrasting fabric beneath. The fashion spread through his court, and some say it inspired the flamboyant, slashed style that would later sweep Renaissance Europe. Even in defeat, the man knew how to leave a mark, at least in tailoring. The years after Nicopolis are spent shoring up his rule at home. He faces rebellions from the Hungarian nobility, uprisings in Croatia, and a fractious relationship with the papacy. In 1401, he's even imprisoned by his own lords in Buda Castle, released only after agreeing to share power. You remember walking through the corridors after his return guards doubled at every door, Sigismund greeting visitors with smiles that never reach his eyes. His ambitions don't shrink with age. By the 1412, he's crowned King of Germany and begins maneuvering for the imperial title. His involvement in the Council of Constance, 1414-1418, is meant to heal the great schism in the Catholic Church, and in that, at least, he succeeds. But the same council condemns Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer, to the stake, a decision that will ignite the Hussite Wars and complicate Sigismund's later rule in Bohemia. You travel with him to Prague in 1420, when he attempts to claim the Bohemian throne after the death of King Wenceslaus IV. The reception is cold. The Hussites see him as a usurper and a betrayer of Huss's promise of safe conduct. Before long, you're riding through smoke and ash as his forces are driven back by fanatical Hussite armies wielding war wagons like moving fortresses. By the time Sigismund finally secures Bohemia in the late 1422, the victory feels hollow, less a triumph than a long, grinding exhaustion. He spends his final years as Holy Roman Emperor, traveling constantly between his territories, trying to hold together a patchwork empire with letters, bribes, and the occasional marriage alliance. One autumn evening in 1437, you find yourself in Znojmo, Moravia, where Sigismund lies ill. The air smells of candle wax and medicinal herbs. Around his bed, courtiers wait with the patient greed of men measuring how long until the next reign begins. Sigismund murmurs instructions for his burial in Nagyvarad, beside his first wife. He dies soon after, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the man himself, part ambitious statesman, part unlucky general, part survivor, in a world that rarely forgave mistakes. Walking out into the chill night, you wonder whether history will remember Sigismund for the councils he convened, the crowns he gathered, or the fields he lost. Perhaps it will remember all three, bound together like the mismatched fabrics of his favourite clothes, a patchwork reign that was never as strong as it looked from a distance. The winter air in Westminster bites through wool and fur, the Thames running dark under a low grey sky. Traders haul barrels across the frosted wharves, their breath blooming in the cold, while within the palace walls the air is warmer but no less tense. Richard II of England sits beneath a canopy embroidered with the arms of Plantagenet, his slender frame draped in silks that ripple like water when he moves. His expression is composed, almost serene, yet there is steel behind the calm, and it has already cut more than one man. Richard's story begins with tragedy. Crowned at just 10 years old after the death of his grandfather, Edward III, he inherits a kingdom that is still fighting the 100 Years' War and weathering the social upheaval of the Black Death. A mainstream historical fact, in 1381, as a boy, king of only 14, Richard famously confronted the leaders of the peasants' revolt at Smithfield, agreeing to their demands before turning on them and crushing the uprising. To some, it was a display of courage. To others, the first glimpse of a ruler who would never forgive a slight. Now, years later, that same capacity for swift reversal defines his reign. You watch him in council, listening to his advisers discuss a proposed tax to fund campaigns in France. Richard's fingers drum against the armrest. His uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, urges caution, warning that the Commons will not bear another levy. Richard smiles thinly and says nothing. 2 weeks later, the tax is passed, its burden falling hardest on those least able to pay, and Gloucester finds himself under investigation for treason. Historians still argue whether Richard's downfall was the result of a dangerous streak of absolutism, or simply the misfortune of ruling in an era when Parliament's influence was growing. Either way, his belief in the divine authority of kings leaves him unwilling to compromise. A quirky tidbit from the royal kitchens. Richard was a culinary innovator, commissioning elaborate feasts with dishes from across Europe and the Mediterranean. He is said to have introduced the concept of the menu to England, so guests could know what extravagance awaited them before the first course arrived. But these feasts, heavy with imported spices and gilded confections, also fed the perception that he cared more for display than for the realm's finances. By the 1392nd, Richard surrounds himself with a circle of loyalists who owe their fortunes to him alone. He rewards them lavishly, confiscating lands from those who oppose him. Parliament becomes less a partner than an obstacle, and when it resists, Richard sidesteps it entirely. His tours of the kingdom take on the tone of royal theatre processions, pageants, and carefully staged acts of generosity, meant to project majesty while concealing the cracks beneath. But power hoarded breeds resentment. In 1397, Richard strikes at the Lords Appellant nobles who had once curbed his authority by force. Some are executed, others exiled, and their estates redistributed to the king's allies. The purge shocks even his supporters. You can feel the shift in the air at court. Men bow lower, speak softer, but their eyes are restless. The fatal blow comes not from Parliament but from family. In 1399, Richard's cousin Henry Bolingbroke returns from exile while the king is campaigning in Ireland. Claiming to seek only the restoration of his inheritance, Henry gathers support with alarming speed. You return with Richard to find much of the realm already siding with Henry. The king's usual composure cracks. He retreats to Conway Castle, then to Flint, where he surrenders under the promise of fair treatment. You are present in Westminster Hall that autumn when Richard, now a prisoner, is forced to abdicate. The ceremonial language is polite, but the moment is raw. A monarch who believed utterly in his unassailable right to rule is handing over the crown to the man he once banished. The hall is silent, except for the rustle of parchment and the creak of wood. What follows is quieter still. Richard is moved to Pontefract Castle, where the winter winds whistle through the stone like a dirge. Officially, he dies of voluntary abstinence, refusing food until his strength fails. Unofficially, the rumours are darker, that he was murdered on Henry's orders, starved or struck down in his cell. When the news reaches London, there is no great outpouring of grief. Some remember the boy who calmed a mob, more recall the man who ruled with a velvet glove over an iron fist. As you walk along the frozen Thames that winter, you think about how quickly majesty can curdle into mistrust, and how a crown, once set askew, is almost impossible to straighten again. The chill wind off the Baltic tastes of iron as you step onto the quayside in Stockholm. The harbour is alive with the smell of tar, wet rope, and fish, yet there's an uneasy quiet under the bustle. Word has it the king himself, Christian II of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, has arrived in the city not for trade or treaty, but to settle scores. His enemies call him Christian Tyrann, Christian the Tyrant, and within days you will understand why. At first glance, he is not an imposing figure average in height, with a narrow face and an almost scholarly air. He speaks softly, with a hint of charm, and it's easy to see how he once won Swedish nobles to his cause. A mainstream historical fact. In 1520, after defeating the forces of Swedish regent Sten Sture the Younger, Christian was crowned King of Sweden in a lavish ceremony meant to signal unity across the Kalmar Union. You attend the coronation feast in the Great Hall of Stockholm's castle. The stone walls are draped with banners, torches flicker against tapestries, and the tables sag under the weight of roast meats and honeyed pastries. Christian makes gracious toasts, praising the loyalty of the Swedish nobility, thanking them for their part in restoring peace. Goblets clink, music swells, and for a moment you think the rumours of his cruelty might be exaggerated. Historians still argue whether what happened next was premeditated or a reaction to whispers of conspiracy. On the third day of celebrations, Christian orders the castle gates shut. Armed guards surround the hall. One by one, the leading Swedish nobles, bishops, knights, councillors are accused of heresy for supporting the recently defeated regency. There is no trial, only the reading of charges. Within hours, the executions begin in the castle courtyard. The scene is chaos. You stand among the crowd as names are called, men dragged forward, swords and axes flashing in the cold light. Blood runs down the cobbles, steaming in the November air. Over 70 people are killed in what will become known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. The celebrations are over. Now, the city smells of death. A quirky tidbit that survivors pass along in whispers. Christian supposedly kept a ledger of everyone executed, not as a legal record, but as a personal trophy of his justice. Whether true or not, it cements his reputation as a ruler who saw vengeance as a form of bookkeeping. The aftermath is swift and brutal. Christian's display of power drives many Swedes, including the young noble Gustav Vasa, into rebellion. You travel with Christian back to Denmark. The king, convinced his decisive blow has secured the union, but in the countryside of Sweden, the bloodbath becomes a rallying cry. By 1523, Gustav Vasa leads a successful uprising, reclaiming Sweden and ending the Kalmar Union for good. Christian, forced to retreat to Denmark, finds his own nobility turning against him. Discontent over high taxes, foreign wars, and his ruthless policies erupts. That same year, he is deposed by his uncle Frederick I. Christian flees, spending years in exile across the Low Countries. In 1531, in an audacious move, he tries to reclaim his throne with a small fleet, landing in Norway under promises of safe conduct. The promises dissolve. He is captured and imprisoned in Sonderborg Castle. You visit him there years later, the once feared king now a prisoner pacing a stone chamber, with windows barred against the sea. Some say he was confined in a drinking tower, a round room so small he could never fully stretch out, though others insist this is an embellishment. Either way, the man who had once held 3 crowns now holds only memories of the day he traded celebration for slaughter. When Christian II dies in 1559, he has spent nearly 3 decades in captivity. His legacy survives mostly in Swedish history books as a symbol of treachery, and in Danish ones as a cautionary tale of ambition gone too far. Walking away from the castle where he drew his last breath, you can almost hear the echo of the Stockholm bells ringing, not for a coronation, but for a reckoning that stained the snow red. The streets of Seville shimmer in the Andalusian sun, whitewashed walls glaring bright, the scent of oranges drifting over the tiled roofs. In the royal quarter, trumpets blare as Alfonso XI of Castile rides in from campaign, his armour dusted with the grime of the road. The people cheer, but their applause feels obligatory, as though they've learned that failing to cheer is noticed. Alfonso has spent much of his reign fighting wars against the Moors in Granada, against rebellious nobles, even against his own in-laws, and the constant campaigns have left Castile weary. Alfonso took the throne as a boy of just 1 year old, his minority marked by civil war among rival regents, a mainstream historical fact. When he came of age, he consolidated power with ruthless efficiency, executing opponents and breaking the back of noble resistance. In military matters he was formidable. In peacetime, he seemed unable or unwilling to rest. You see him in council, still wearing a dented breastplate as he listens to reports of plague in Seville. It's the spring of 1348, and the Black Death is already creeping into Iberia. His advisors urge caution, warning of empty fields and shuttered markets, but Alfonso's eyes gleam at news of a Moorish border raid. Instead of focusing on the pestilence, he orders preparations for another campaign, as if war can be fought in a vacuum, while death walks through the streets. Historians still argue whether this was blind arrogance or a calculated gamble to keep the nobility united through a common enemy. Either way, the effect is devastating. With so many men drawn to the front, the plague burns unchecked through towns and villages. You pass through a hamlet on your way south and see fields overgrown, doors marked with crude crosses, the air heavy with the sweet rot of abandoned homes. A quirky tidbit that clings to his legend, Alfonso was known for his obsession with hunting. Even during military campaigns he would detour to chase boar or deer, sometimes delaying his army's march for days. He once ordered a hunting lodge built in the mountains, purely so he could stalk game between battles. On the frontier with Granada, his forces besieged the fortified town of Gibraltar. You stand on a rocky slope overlooking the strait, watching ships maneuver in the blue water below. The siege is long and grinding, supplies thinning as the summer heat intensifies. In camp, rumors spread of sickness creeping among the soldiers' fever, swelling, death within days. Alfonso ignores it, walking the lines in armor, speaking to captains about the final push. Then, one sweltering afternoon in March 1350, the king falls ill. At first it seems like exhaustion, but the telltale swellings appear, and soon he is feverish, raving. The camp physicians do what they can, herbs, vinegar, charms, but nothing slows the disease. You are in the royal tent when he demands to be propped up on cushions so he can look toward Gibraltar's walls. "I will not die with my back to the enemy," he says, voice hoarse. Within days he is gone. The siege collapses almost immediately, the army retreating north in disarray. In Seville the bells toll and the people mourn, but the grief is complicated. Some remember a warrior king who pushed back the borders of Granada. Others remember the empty granaries, the abandoned farms, and the way the plague ran rampant while their ruler chased glory. As you walk away from the city in the hot, dusty wind, you can't help but think that Alfonso XI's greatest flaw was not cruelty or incompetence, but an inability to imagine a world where war was not the answer to every problem. Even the Black Death could not distract him from his battles, and in the end it fought him on its own terms, and won. The sun rises over the jagged peaks of the Pyrenees, spilling gold across the tiled roofs of Zaragoza. In the royal palace, courtiers cluster in the shaded arcades, their conversations hushed, wary. John II of Aragon rules here, an aging monarch whose smile rarely reaches his eyes, and whose promises, when they come, have a habit of dissolving like mist. His reign has been a tapestry of civil wars, shifting alliances, and personal betrayals, and the threads are beginning to fray. John's road to power was paved with family disputes, a mainstream historical fact. He was originally King of Navarre through marriage to Queen Blanche I, but when she died in 1441, he refused to cede the crown to their son, Charles, Prince of Viana, as the Navarrese laws demanded. Instead, John clung to it, sparking years of strife between father and son. In Navarre, some called it a theft. In Aragon, many called it a disaster. You see him now in the council chamber, leaning on a cane, listening as envoys report unrest in Catalonia. The region is seething over his taxation policies and his perceived favoritism toward Castilian advisors. John nods gravely, assures them he will address their grievances, and then when the envoys are gone, orders another levy on Catalan towns to fund his campaigns in Navarre. The duplicity is so casual it barely feels like a choice. Historians still argue whether John's decisions were driven by necessity in a fractured kingdom, or by a deep mistrust of anyone outside his immediate circle. Either way, his unwillingness to compromise has turned potential allies into lifelong enemies. A quirky tidbit from the palace kitchens: John had an unusual fondness for bitter flavors. He would demand his cooks lace sauces with wormwood, or serve candied citrus peel dipped in vinegar. "Sweetness without bite is useless," he once said, a sentiment that seems to mirror his approach to politics. By the late 1452, Catalonia is in open revolt. You walk the streets of Barcelona and see banners fluttering from balconies, not with the royal arms, but with the insignia of the rebel council. The air smells of salt and tallow, and every alley hums with talk of resisting the king. The war that follows, known as the Catalan Civil War, drags on for a decade, its sieges and skirmishes leaving towns scarred and fields untended. John's personal life is no less turbulent. His second wife, Juana Enriquez, fiercely supports his cause, but her influence over him only deepens Catalan resentment. Meanwhile, his relationship with his son Charles deteriorates beyond repair. In 1461, Charles dies suddenly under suspicious circumstances after being imprisoned by his father. The official cause is illness. The popular belief is poison. In the plazas, people whisper the prince's name with a mix of pity and fury. As the war grinds on, John suffers a personal blow. He loses his sight in the mid-1462. Yet blindness does nothing to blunt his political instincts. You watch him in an audience hall, seated in darkness but still commanding the room, his voice sharp as he dictates orders. He remembers names, debts, and insults with unnerving precision. By the time peace is finally brokered in the late 1472, John is an old man, worn but unbowed. His rule has left Aragon and Navarre battered, their coffers drained, their people exhausted. And yet, in a final twist of irony, his legacy will not be the wars he fought but the dynasty he leaves behind. His son Ferdinand II, who will marry Isabella of Castile and unite Spain under one crown. On a winter evening in 1479, John dies in Barcelona. The city mourns, but the mourning feels formal, practiced. Walking away through the narrow streets, you pass a tavern where a patron mutters, "Good riddance," before raising his cup. For some, John II will always be the man who traded trust for power, promising peace with one hand while sharpening a dagger with the other. The wind off the Firth of Forth carries the smell of salt and peat smoke as you cross the drawbridge into Edinburgh Castle. Inside, banners snap in the gusts, the lion rampant of Scotland bright against the grey sky. Today the court is tense, wary of its own king. James II of Scotland, young but already infamous for flashes of violent temper, is holding an audience, and rumour says tempers will flare before the day is out. James came to the throne at just 6 years old after the murder of his father, James I, in 1437. A mainstream historical fact, his early reign was dominated by regents and guardians, each using the boy, king, as a pawn in their power struggles. By the time he took real control in the 1442nd, he had little patience for noble families who challenged his authority, most famously the Black Douglases, the most powerful magnates in Scotland. You see him now, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair curling around a crown that still looks slightly too heavy for his head. He listens to the Earl of Douglas present some grievance, nodding slowly, then invites him to a private chamber for frank discussion. You follow at a distance, just close enough to hear voices rising. Then there's a sudden crash, a shout, and the door bursts open. The king emerges, sword in hand, its edge wet and dark. The earl lies inside, lifeless. Later, James will claim the earl was plotting treason. No one dares dispute it. Historians still argue whether this killing was premeditated or a spur-of-the-moment outburst. Either way, it sends shockwaves through the kingdom. Some nobles submit, cowed by the king's willingness to act without hesitation. Others nurse grudges that will smoulder for years. A quirky tidbit from the royal stables. James was fascinated by artillery, often tinkering with small cannon designs himself. He would spend hours among the gunners, inspecting barrels and discussing powder mixtures, far more animated than in most council meetings. This obsession would later prove both a strength and a curse. Through the 1452nd, James systematically dismantles the power of the great lords, redistributing lands to secure loyalty. The Black Douglases, once untouchable, are driven into exile. Scotland grows more stable under his firm if brutal hand, and James begins to focus on fortifications and military innovations. But in 1460, while besieging Roxburgh Castle, held by the English, his fascination with artillery meets its tragic end. You're there on a warm August afternoon, the air thick with gunpowder and the sharp tang of burning wicks. James is inspecting a massive bombard, one of his prized siege guns, when it explodes without warning. The blast tears through the air, and in the ringing silence that follows, the king lies mortally wounded. The camp erupts in shouts and confusion. The young heir, James III, is hastily proclaimed king, even as his father's body is carried away. The siege continues, driven more by rage than strategy, and Roxburgh falls within days. Yet the victory feels hollow. Back in Edinburgh, the news spreads quickly. Some mourn sincerely, remembering a king who brought order to a chaotic realm. Others recall the blood on the floor of that chamber years ago, and mutter that he reaped what he sowed. As you leave the castle, the sun dips behind the hills, casting the city in shadow. You can almost see James's restless figure pacing the battlements, eyes always on the horizon, looking for the next fortress to take, never imagining that his greatest weapon would be the one to kill him. The hills of Kosovo roll away under a pale dawn sky as you ride toward the crumbling walls of Skopje. The markets are quiet, the air smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside the fortress, Stephen Uroš V of Serbia, called Uroš the Weak by his own people, sits on a carved throne that looks too large for him, both in size and in responsibility. Stephen inherited an empire that was already beginning to unravel. A mainstream historical fact, his father, Stefan Dušan, had built the Serbian Empire into the dominant power in the Balkans during the mid-14th century, stretching from the Danube to the Aegean. When Dušan died in 1355, Stephen was just 19. He received the crown, but not his father's commanding presence or iron hand. You see him in council, surrounded by powerful magnates, each of whom commands more troops and coin than the king himself. They bow politely, but their eyes flick toward one another, weighing alliances. Stephen speaks softly, almost hesitantly, as they debate border skirmishes with the Byzantines and raids from the Ottomans. His proposals are vague, his instructions easily sidestepped. Historians still argue whether Stephen's mild nature could have worked in a less fractious realm or whether the empire was destined to splinter after his father's overextension. What's certain is that under his watch, central authority collapses. Provincial lords become de facto rulers, striking their own deals with foreign powers. A quirky tidbit from the palace servants. Stephen was said to be genuinely pious, attending church services daily and sometimes fasting beyond what was required. This might have earned respect in another context, but here it only deepens the perception that he belongs more in a monastery than on a battlefield. By the 1362nd, the Ottomans are pressing harder into the Balkans, and Serbian territories begin to peel away like old paint. You travel with Stephen to meet with one of his more loyal vassals, but the loyalty feels conditional, more courtesy than conviction. At banquets, toasts are made in his name, but the real negotiations happen in private chambers without him. In 1371, the defining blow falls at the Battle of Maritsa. Two of Serbia's most powerful lords march south to confront the Ottomans without coordinating with the king. You hear the story days later, how their army was ambushed in the night, cut to pieces before dawn. The loss leaves much of Macedonia and Thrace open to Ottoman control. Stephen does not lead a counterattack. Instead, he withdraws to the north, retreating into a smaller and smaller sphere of influence. The empire in name becomes little more than a loose collection of independent lordships. You walk the streets of Prizren and see the old imperial palace shuttered, weeds creeping between its stones. By 1377, Stephen Uroš V is dead, childless, without an heir to claim even the shrunken remnants of his realm. His death marks the official end of the Serbian Empire. Chroniclers write of his gentle nature, his reluctance to spill blood, and his inability to stand against the ambitions of his own nobility. As you ride away from the empty throne room, you think of how some kings are hated for the harm they do, while others are pitied for the harm they allow. Stephen Uroš V falls into the second category, a ruler whose reign was not marked by tyranny or cruelty, but by the slow, quiet surrender of power until nothing remained to defend. The Baltic wind is sharp enough to sting your cheeks as you stand on the deck of a warship bound for the mouth of the Vistula River. The banners of Poland snap overhead, their white eagles stark against the grey sky. At the helm of this ill-fated expedition is Władysław III, a young king with more enthusiasm than experience, steering his people toward what he believes will be a righteous victory. His reign is brief, his ambitions dangerously high, and his end will be as sudden as it is tragic. Władysław came to power in 1434 at just 10 years old, inheriting the throne of Poland from his father, Władysław II Jagiełło. A mainstream historical fact, in 1440, he was also crowned King of Hungary, creating a fragile personal union meant to counter the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire. This dual kingship gave him a vast realm on the map, but on the ground, it was two kingdoms with different interests, different advisors, and very different appetites for war. You first see him in the Great Hall of Buda, barely 20 years old, his armor polished to a mirror shine. He is listening to envoys from the papacy, urging a crusade against the Ottomans. The young king nods eagerly, his eyes bright with the zeal of someone convinced destiny has chosen him for greatness. Older lords exchange wary glances, sensing the risks, but Władysław is already imagining banners flying over Constantinople. Historians still argue whether his decision to march south in 1444 was genuine religious conviction or political calculation to secure his standing among fractious Hungarian nobles. Either way, he commits his forces to the campaign, bolstered by papal promises of aid and naval support. A quirky tidbit from the Hungarian court. Władysław reportedly enjoyed composing short verses in Latin, reciting them to amuse his companions during long journeys. Some of these poems survive in fragments, praising both military valor and the fleeting beauty of lifelines that take on a haunting resonance given what's to come. The campaign begins well enough. You ride with the army through the plains of Bulgaria, the autumn air crisp, the soldiers in high spirits. But at Varna, on the Black Sea coast, the tide turns. The promised Venetian fleet fails to block the Ottoman crossing of the Bosporus, and Sultan Murad II meets the Crusaders with a far larger force than expected. On the morning of the 10th of November, 1444, Władysław rides at the head of his knights, his standard fluttering in the cold wind. The opening clashes are fierce but balanced until the young king, against the advice of his generals, launches a direct charge at the Ottoman centre, aiming for Murad himself. You watch in disbelief as his small contingent becomes surrounded. The royal banner wavers, then vanishes in a sea of enemy soldiers. Moments later, word spreads through the lines: the king has fallen. The exact details of his death are lost to the chaos. Some say he was struck down by janissaries, others that his head was taken to be displayed in the Sultan's camp. Without his presence, the Crusader army collapses. By nightfall, the field is littered with the dead, the sound of the sea mingling with the cries of the wounded. When you return to Buda with the survivors, the city is draped in mourning. Władysław's body is never recovered, and his fate becomes a subject of legend. Some claim he lived on in hiding, others spin tales of miraculous escape, but the truth is more sobering. His gamble at Varna ended not only his life, but also the last major united crusade against the Ottomans for a generation. Walking along the Vistula years later, you think of him not as the hero his supporters dreamed of, nor as the reckless youth his critics derided, but as a king who believed utterly in a single, glorious moment and rode into it without looking back. The pale winter light over Naples gives the sea an almost metallic sheen, the waves slapping against the stone quays in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Fishermen pull their boats onto the shore, glancing up toward Castelnuovo, where King Charles II of Naples, called the Lame after an old injury, sits in council. His reign is one long balancing act between ambition and concession, and though he keeps his throne, the price he pays leaves the kingdom weakened and resentful. Charles inherited the crown in 1285, after the turbulent reign of his father, Charles I, and the bitter war of the Sicilian Vespers. A mainstream historical fact. Much of Sicily had already slipped from Angevine control to the Aragonese, and Charles spent decades trying and failing to bring it back. His diplomacy produced treaties and promises, but rarely victories, and his subjects soon learned that their king's word on foreign policy could turn as quickly as the tide. You first see him in a grand audience, the hall lit with tall beeswax candles that throw shifting shadows across frescoed walls. Envoys from Aragon are present, as are delegates from the papacy. Charles leans forward, speaking in the measured tones of a man who has negotiated so often that he knows every rhetorical turn by heart. He is discussing yet another peace treaty, one that will leave Sicily in Aragonese hands in exchange for vague pledges of mutual cooperation. Historians still argue whether these treaties were shrewd attempts to stabilize Naples or admissions of total defeat. Either way, they cost the kingdom dearly. Sicily's ports, wealth, and strategic position are gone for good. A quirky tidbit from the palace servants. Charles was known to carry a small, jewel-encrusted reliquary of the True Cross everywhere he went. He would touch it before important decisions, claiming it gave him clarity. Whether it brought him wisdom or merely reassurance, no one could say. The king's other focus is on rebuilding Naples itself, fortifying the harbour, encouraging trade, and patronizing religious institutions. You walk with him through the streets as he visits the construction of new convents and churches, pausing to speak with monks and nuns. Yet even here, the shadow of political compromise looms. Many of these projects are funded with loans from foreign bankers, debts that will later tighten their grip on the crown. In foreign affairs, Charles is pulled into the endless web of Italian politics alliances with Florence and Genoa, rivalries with Venice, negotiations with the French crown. Each move is careful, deliberate, but often reactive rather than visionary. Naples, once poised to dominate southern Italy and Sicily, becomes instead a cautious participant in other people's games. The final blow to his prestige comes not from a battlefield but from the Treaty of Carta in 1302, which formally ends the conflict over Sicily. The treaty confirms Aragon's control, and while it brings peace, it also cements Naples' diminished role in Mediterranean politics. You are there in the council chamber when the terms are read aloud. Charles nods as if satisfied, but his knuckles whiten on the armrest of his chair. In his later years, Charles turns increasingly to religious devotion. He sponsors pilgrimages, attends processions, and retreats for long periods to monasteries. Yet the political realities remain unchanged. Naples is stable, but only because its ambitions have been clipped. When Charles dies in 1309, the city gives him a solemn funeral. The streets are lined with clergy and citizens, and the tolling of church bells carries far out over the bay. But behind the prayers and chants, there's an undercurrent of quiet resignation. The king who promised to restore the glory of Sicily leaves behind a kingdom intact, yes, but smaller, quieter, and less feared than before. As you walk away from the Castel Nuovo into the sea air, you think about how not all hated kings are hated for cruelty or tyranny. Some earn it through a slow erosion of hope, by turning every bold chance into a careful retreat until the people no longer believe their crown can win anything worth fighting for. The late afternoon sun in Constantinople slants over gilded domes and weathered city walls, the Bosporus flashing like a strip of molten glass. The streets are crowded with merchants, priests, and imperial guards, their armor dulled by the city's endless dust. In the palace at Blackenay, Andronikos I Komnenos, tall, silver-haired, and with eyes that gleam more like a predator's than a saint's, holds court. His reign has been short, his path to power paved with charm, rebellion, and more than a little blood. Andronikos was no stranger to scandal before he took the throne in 1183, a mainstream historical fact. He had spent years in exile, wandering from the courts of the Caucasus to the Crusader states, notorious for his liaisons and intrigues. When he returned to Byzantium, he played the role of reformer, denouncing corrupt officials and promising justice for the common people. At first, it worked. The city greeted him as a savior after the unpopular regency of Maria of Antioch. You see him in his audience chamber, speaking to a crowd of petitioners. His voice is rich, persuasive, and when he calls himself the guardian of the people, the words almost sound sincere. But behind the warmth, his gaze flickers to the guards, to the courtiers, to the corners of the room as if measuring threats. Historians still argue whether his early reforms were genuine or simply the opening moves in a bid to secure absolute power. What's clear is that once he had the crown, his tolerance for dissent evaporated. Nobles who questioned him found themselves imprisoned, exiled, or executed. A quirky tidbit from palace gossip. Andronikos liked to walk the streets of Constantinople in disguise, listening to what his subjects said about him. In the first months of his reign, this earned him praise. Later, it became a tool for vengeance when he used overheard complaints as pretexts for arrest. The turning point comes when foreign policy meets paranoia. The Norman kingdom of Sicily invades in 1185, sacking Thessalonica and threatening the capital. Andronikos responds with frantic preparations, fortifying walls, calling up troops. But his harsh rule has alienated much of the military leadership. Some obey him grudgingly. Others quietly hope the Normans will finish what they started. As the siege fears mount, so do the purges. You witness public executions in the Hippodrome, the condemned accused of treachery with little proof. The air smells of sweat, fear, and iron. Even those who once cheered his rise begin to wonder if they have traded one tyrant for another. The blow finally comes from within. While the Normans retreat, a revolt in the capital erupts, led by Isaac Angelos. You are there on the day the mob storms, the palace roaring, carrying makeshift weapons, their anger built from years of broken promises and sudden violence. Andronikos flees through secret passages but is caught before he can escape the city. What follows is one of the most brutal ends a Byzantine emperor ever faced. Dragged through the streets, beaten and mocked, he is tied to a pillar in the Hippodrome. The same crowd that once hailed him now tears at him with their hands. their voices rising in a roar that drowns out the clanging of the palace bells. When it's over, the body of Andronikos Ikomnenos is barely recognizable. In the days that follow, Constantinople returns to its familiar rhythm markets opening, churches filling with incense, but the memory lingers. He will be remembered not only for the fear he inspired, but for the bitter irony of his reign. A man who promised to be the people's champion, only to become their executioner. As you walk away from the hippodrome, the shouts still ringing in your ears, you can't help but think that in Byzantium, the line between savior and tyrant was always a razor's edge, and Andronikos fell to one side the moment he stopped listening to the very people who put him there. A damp winter mist rolls in from the Golden Horn, blurring the spires and sea walls of Constantinople. The city still bears the scars of its Latin occupation decades earlier, churches patched with mismatched stone, marketplaces where Venetian coins pass as easily as Byzantine. In the Great Palace, Michael VIII, Palaiologos walks slowly along a mosaic corridor, his steps deliberate, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the present moment. He is the emperor who reclaimed the city for Byzantium in 1261. Yet for many, he is remembered less as a restorer and more as a betrayer. Michael seized power in 1259 as co-emperor to the young John IV Lascaris, ostensibly to protect the boy's inheritance. A mainstream historical fact, after retaking Constantinople from the Latin Empire, Michael consolidated his position by blinding John IV and confining him to a monastery, an act that alienated many of his own subjects. The Church in particular regarded it as both a crime and a stain on his legitimacy. You see him now in the throne room, a tall man in imperial robes embroidered with gold eagles, listening to an envoy from the West. The envoy brings talk of union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a political necessity, Michael believes, to secure military aid against the advancing Turks. He agrees to terms that concede far more to Rome than most of his people can stomach. Historians still argue whether this church union was a masterstroke of diplomacy or a desperate gamble that eroded the empire from within. In practice, it sparks riots, especially in the monasteries, where monks denounce Michael as a heretic. A quirky tidbit from palace rumour: Michael was said to have an almost superstitious attachment to his hunting hawks. He kept them in specially heated chambers during the winter and travelled with them even on diplomatic missions, claiming their flight steadied his thoughts. Externally, his reign is a constant balancing act. He wins a major diplomatic victory by allying with Genoa, giving them trade privileges in return for naval support. But this alliance alienates Venice, sparking yet another trade war. You travel with his fleet to defend against a Venetian raid, the decks slick with sea spray, the crew tense as the wind shifts. In the Balkans, Michael's ambitions lead to the disastrous Battle of Pelagonia in 1259, where his forces managed to capture several rival princes. Yet instead of cementing unity, he spends the next years mired in shifting alliances, each one trading short-term gains for long-term instability. By the 1272, his focus on Western diplomacy leaves Asia Minor dangerously exposed. Turkish raiders push deeper into Byzantine territory, capturing towns that have been part of the empire for centuries. In the marketplaces of Constantinople, merchants complain openly that the emperor cares more about Rome than about defending his own people. You are there in 1282 when the Sicilian Vespers erupt a massive uprising against the French in Sicily that reshapes the Mediterranean political map. Michael has backed the rebellion indirectly, hoping to weaken Charles of Anjou, a potential invader. The plan works, but it earns him the lasting hatred of the papacy, undoing years of careful negotiation. That winter, Michael dies suddenly while campaigning in Thrace. His funeral is held in the imperial city he reclaimed, but the patriarch refuses to bury him in the main church because of his union with Rome. His body is laid instead in a monastery he had founded, attended by a court divided between those who praise his vision and those who curse his compromises. As you step outside into the damp, cold air, the gulls crying over the harbour, you think about the contradictions of his reign. the emperor who restored Constantinople but blinded a boy to keep his crown, who courted the West but lost ground in the East. History will remember him as both savior and traitor, often in the same breath. The low clouds over London sag heavy with rain, their weight mirrored in the mood of Westminster Hall. Servants hurry across the flagstones, heads bent, while the great hearths throw out more smoke than warmth. On the throne sits Henry VI of England, robed in deep crimson, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His gaze is fixed not on the lords assembled before him, but somewhere far beyond the walls, a place only he can see. Henry inherited the crown in 1422 as an infant, becoming King of England and, by claim, of France. A mainstream historical fact. His early reign was managed by capable regents, and for a time England held large swaths of French territory. But once Henry came of age, the fortunes of the crown began to crumble. His gentle, pious nature was ill-suited to the ruthless politics of the 100 Years' War. You watch him now, as messengers report the loss of another French stronghold. The words seem to pass over him. He nods vaguely, murmurs about praying for the dead. The lords exchange uneasy glances, for they know prayer will not hold Normandy. Henry's bouts of mental collapse periods when he cannot speak or recognize those around him have left the kingdom adrift, and each recovery is only partial. Historians still argue whether his illness was inherited madness, the product of stress, or a combination of both. In court, it is simply called the King's Trouble, and it has become as much a political factor as any law or tax. A quirky tidbit from the royal household. Henry was obsessed with architecture, personally sketching designs for Eton College and King's College Chapel in Cambridge. Even in the midst of military disaster, he would pore over plans for vaulted ceilings and stained glass, finding comfort in stone and symmetry when the world outside refused to align. By the 1452nd, discontent is boiling. Losses in France lead to unrest at home, and factions gather around rival claimants from the House of York. You stand in the great hall as Richard, Duke of York, strides in, his voice steady as he demands a stronger hand in governance. Henry agrees one day, retracts the next, as if unable to decide whether York is a threat or a saviour. The Wars of the Roses begin almost inevitably. You ride with Henry's army to St. Albans in 1455, where battle breaks out in the streets. The king is wounded and captured, and though he is restored later, his authority is now a prize to be seized rather than a force to be obeyed. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, takes up the fight in his name, proving far more decisive than her husband. In 1461, the Yorkist Edward IV seizes the throne. Henry flees north, then into exile in Scotland. For years he is a ghost king, surfacing only when Lancastrian hopes flicker back to life. In 1470, a rebellion briefly restores him to the throne, but he is a figurehead, the real power held by his allies. Within a year, Edward IV returns, and Henry is imprisoned in the Tower of London. You are there in May 1471. The night word spreads that Henry is dead. The official cause is melancholy, brought on by bad news. The whispered truth is that he was murdered, quietly and efficiently, to end the Lancastrian threat. His funeral is modest, his legacy already being rewritten by the victors. As you walk through the rain-slick streets away from the tower, you think about how Henry VI's reign is defined not by what he did, but by what he could not bring himself to do, rule with the firmness his crown required. In the end, his gentleness became both his virtue and his undoing, a fragile candle in a storm that never passed. The winter sky over Moscow hangs low and grey, the air sharp with wood smoke from 100 chimneys. Snow crunches underfoot as you cross the Kremlin courtyard toward the golden-domed cathedrals. Inside the palace, a boy sits on the throne, his legs not yet long enough to touch the floor. This is Ivan IV of Russia in his youth, years before the name the Terrible will be attached to him. Even now, there are flickers of something unsettling in his gaze. Ivan's father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when the boy was just 3 years old. A mainstream historical fact, the regency was placed in the hands of his mother, Elena Glinskaya, but she died suddenly, possibly poisoned when Ivan was 8. After that, the boyars, the powerful noble families of Muscovy, ruled in his name. They also ruled his childhood, and not kindly. You see him at a feast where the boyars drink and boast, ignoring the thin, quiet child at the far end of the table. Servants whisper that he is often left without proper care, given scraps while the nobles gorge themselves. Sometimes, for sport, they send him out into the courtyard in winter without a coat, just to watch him shiver. Historians still argue whether the cruelties of these years planted the seeds of the man Ivan would become. What's clear is that he learned early how to watch, remember, and wait. A quirky tidbit from the palace. Ivan kept a small menagerie of pets, rabbits, birds, even a tame bear. The bear was said to have been a gift from a visiting noble, and according to rumour, Ivan would sometimes feed it from his own plate. In later years, when the bear died, he had it buried with more ceremony than some of his human attendants ever received. As he grows into adolescence, Ivan's quiet watchfulness sharpens into calculation. At 13, he orders the execution of Prince Andrei Shwisky, one of the most powerful boyars, after accusing him of disrespect. The court is shocked, not so much by the death itself, as by the sudden realization that the boy they had dismissed as pliable has teeth and is willing to use them. In public, Ivan can still play the role of dutiful ruler. He attends church services, participates in hunts, and listens attentively to his advisors. In private, his temper flares unpredictably. Servants learn to read the tightness of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, as signs to vanish from the room before his anger finds a target. By the time he is crowned Tsar of all Russia at 16, the first ruler to take that title, he is determined never again to be at the mercy of those who once humiliated him. The coronation is a lavish spectacle. Incense thick in the air, golden vestments gleaming in the candlelight. To the watching nobles, it's a display of imperial authority. To Ivan, it's the sealing of a promise he has carried since childhood, that no one will ever treat him as a powerless boy again. As you leave the Kremlin that day, the snow beginning to fall in heavy flakes, you wonder how much of the man the world will one day fear is already here, in the boy who learned early that kindness was rare, and power was the only sure defense. The morning mist over the flat fields of Flanders carries the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Along the road to Ghent, riders in fine cloaks pass traders, pushing carts piled with bolts of cloth. These are the lands of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a ruler whose appetite for glory will leave his once prosperous duchy fractured and exhausted. Charles inherits his father Philip, the Good's vast and wealthy Burgundian state in 1467. A mainstream historical fact, Burgundy under Philip had been a centre of art, trade and diplomacy, but Charles has little patience for courtly games. He dreams of carving out a kingdom that will stretch from the North Sea to the Alps, binding his scattered territories into a single realm. You see him in the Great Hall of Bruges, tall and broad-shouldered, his armour polished even when no battle is on the horizon. On the walls hang maps marked with ambitious red lines, future campaigns he speaks of, with the certainty of a man already imagining the victory banquets. His counsellors urge caution, pointing to the delicate balance of alliances with France and the Holy Roman Empire. Charles listens, nods once, and then orders preparations for war. Historians still argue whether his campaigns were driven by genuine strategic vision or by a hunger for personal renown. Either way, they drag Burgundy into a near-constant state of conflict. A quirky tidbit from the ducal household. Charles had a habit of eating his meals standing, even when seated service was prepared, claiming it kept his blood ready for battle. It became such a fixture of his routine that courtiers began to imitate him, though more out of fear than admiration. In the late 1462, he turns against France, challenging King Louis XI, his equal, in cunning but opposite in temperament. The wars are costly, the victories uncertain, At the same time, Charles meddles in the politics of the Low Countries, clamping down on rebellious cities like Liège with brutal sieges. You stand in the aftermath of one such siege, the air heavy with the smell of ash, listening to merchants complain that trade will take years to recover. His ambitions reach their peak in the 1472 when he pushes eastward into the territories of Lorraine and against the Swiss Confederation. The campaigns are grueling. The Swiss fight with discipline and ferocity, their pike formations cutting down Burgundian cavalry again and again. Still, Charles refuses to retreat, convinced that one decisive victory will secure his legacy. The winter of 1476 finds you on the road to Nancy, where Charles faces a combined Swiss and Lorrainer force. Snow falls in thick, muffling sheets, cloaking the fields in white. On the morning of the 5th of January, 1477, the battle erupts in a chaos of shouts, drums, and clashing steel. The Burgundian lines buckle under the Swiss assault, and soon the field is a rout. Charles fights on foot in the snow, refusing to flee. By day's end, his body lies unrecognizable, stripped and frozen, found days later beneath a thin layer of ice. When news of his death reaches Burgundy, there is no triumphant heir ready to take his place. The duchy fractures under pressure from France and the Habsburgs, the dream of a Burgundian kingdom dissolving in the winter cold. As you leave Nancy, the snow crunching under your boots, you think about how Charles the Bold's greatest flaw was not a lack of courage, but the inability to temper it. In the end, his relentless push for glory left nothing for his people but broken walls and empty coffers. The midday sun glints off the calm waters of the Bay of Naples, but inside the royal palace the air feels heavy, perfumed with incense to mask the scent of too many closed rooms. Ladislaus of Naples, tall and broad-shouldered with a hawk-like gaze, lounges on a cushioned chair while scribes read aloud the terms of yet another sale. His crown, or rather the rights to it, bartered away like a piece of jewelry in a pawnshop. Born in 1377, Ladislaus came to the throne as a boy after the death of his father, Charles III of Naples. A mainstream historical fact, his early reign was contested by rival claimants backed by powerful patrons, especially Queen Margaret of Durazzo, and the French-supported Louis II of Anjou. Ladislaus clawed his way to sole power by his 20s, using war, diplomacy, and outright purchase to secure recognition from the Pope. You watch him at court as envoys from Rome deliver yet another papal bull confirming his titles. The king smiles graciously, but you know this affirmation was bought not earned by selling concessions of land and influence to the church. It's a pattern that repeats throughout his reign. When money is short, Ladislaus simply mortgages his own authority. Historians still argue whether this habit was a clever survival tactic or a corrosive weakness. It kept him on the throne, but each transaction left Naples more beholden to foreign powers. A quirky tidbit whispered in the palace corridors. Ladislaus enjoyed playing chess for coin, and on more than one occasion he wagered absurd sums, castles, tracts of land over a game. Most were symbolic gestures meant to flatter his opponents, but the court joked that if his treasury ever ran dry, he'd try to win it back over the board. His ambitions stretched beyond Naples. By 1408, Ladislaus was marching north, seeking to dominate much of central Italy. He seized Rome for a brief period, even forcing the Pope into flight, but the occupation drained his coffers and rallied his enemies. You travel with his retinue through the streets of the Eternal City, the sound of his soldiers' boots echoing in ancient forums, knowing it cannot last. Soon he is selling again recognition here, feudal rights there, trading away influence for temporary cash to fund the next military push. The pattern frays alliances. Italian city. States begin to see him as an unreliable partner, a king whose word depends entirely on the state of his treasury. In his final years, illness begins to slow him. The man who once rode at the head of campaigns now rules from bedchambers, issuing orders between bouts of fever. In 1414, at the age of 37, Ladislaus dies, leaving his sister Joanna II to inherit a kingdom weakened by decades of transactional politics. Walking out into the bright Neapolitan sun after his funeral, you hear a merchant mutter, "He sold us piece by piece." It is a fitting epitaph for a ruler whose reign was less a steady march toward greatness than a series of bargains, some shrewd, some desperate, until the crown itself seemed just another commodity to be traded. A cold wind sweeps across the broad market square of Magdeburg, carrying the mingled scents of roasting chestnuts, horse dung, and the river Elbe. Merchants call out prices in Low German, and somewhere in the din a town crier shouts news from the imperial court. Otto IV, Holy Roman Emperor, has issued another decree, one that, like so many before it, promises more than it can deliver. Otto was crowned emperor in 1209 after years of civil war within the empire. A mainstream historical fact. His rise was aided by the Pope, who backed him against his rival, Philip of Swabia. But alliances in imperial politics are as fickle as the northern weather, and Otto's gratitude to the papacy would prove short-lived. You first see him in the Grand Audience Hall at Brunswick, where he stands tall and broad-chested, his golden hair catching the light from the tall windows. He speaks with confidence, promising to defend the church, uphold imperial unity, and restore lost imperial territories in Italy. The bishops nod approvingly, the knights pound their fists on the table. For the moment, the room belongs to him. Historians still argue whether Otto's undoing came from arrogance or simply from overreach. What's certain is that, within a few years of his coronation, he invades Sicily, directly violating his agreement with Pope Innocent III. The result is swift. The Pope excommunicates him, denouncing him as untrustworthy. A quirky tidbit from court gossip. Otto was fond of falconry to the point of distraction. There are stories of him slipping away from political negotiations to ride out after a hawk's flight, leaving envoys cooling their heels in draughty halls. Some joked that his hawks were the only subjects he never quarrelled with. His Sicilian adventure also alienates many German princes, who begin looking to Frederick II, the Pope's new favourite, as a replacement. The break comes in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines, where Otto's forces aligned with England and Flanders are crushed by the French under King Philip II. You are there on the muddy field, the air thick with the smell of trampled grass and sweat, watching the imperial standard fall as Otto is forced to flee. In the aftermath, his authority crumbles. Princes withdraw their loyalty, bishops refuse his commands, and cities quietly shift allegiance to Frederick. By 1218, Otto is reduced to ruling only his hereditary lands in Brunswick, the imperial title little more than an echo. You visit him there in his later years, finding him in a modest hall rather than a glittering court. The man who once dreamed of dominating both Germany and Italy now contents himself with local disputes and hunting trips. His voice is still strong, but when he speaks of the empire, there's a trace of bitterness, as though the crown had been a mirage. Otto IV dies in 1218, buried in Brunswick Cathedral with the trappings of a ruler whose realm had long since slipped from his grasp. As you leave the city, the wind off the river bites harder, and you think of how quickly imperial grandeur can shrink to provincial quiet when a king mistakes the applause of the moment for the loyalty of a lifetime. The rain in Perth falls in a steady, soaking drizzle, turning the narrow streets into glistening ribbons of mud. Merchants hunch under awnings, townsfolk pull their cloaks tight, and all eyes seem to drift toward the looming presence of Scone Palace, where John Balliol, King of Scots in name, but in truth a pawn holds his uneasy court. John's path to the throne was never one of overwhelming support. A mainstream historical fact. In 1290, after a disputed succession crisis known as the Great Cause, King Edward I of England was invited to arbitrate. Edward chose John over other claimants, but only after forcing him to swear fealty as Edward's vassal. That oath would define and poison his reign. You see him seated in the hall at Scone, draped in fine wool, the crown slightly askew on his head. His voice is polite, cautious, as he listens to envoys from Edward I. Their demands are blunt: Scottish troops for Edward's wars, taxes levied at Edward's command, and disputes settled not in Scotland's courts but in England's. John agrees to some, delays others, but it's clear to everyone in the room that the decisions are not truly his to make. Historians still argue whether John was a coward who bent too easily, or a pragmatist who knew open defiance would doom Scotland before it could unite. The result, however, was the same. Contempt from his own nobles, who began calling him Tomb Tabard, empty coat. A quirky tidbit from the royal kitchens. John reportedly had an enduring fondness for spiced French wine, imported at considerable expense. Even when the treasury strained under Edward's demands, casks of the sweet drink continued to arrive, a small indulgence that did little to improve his image among a restless people. The breaking point comes in 1295. Under pressure from his council of nobles, John agrees to an alliance with France, the so-called Old Alliance, directly challenging Edward's authority. The following year, Edward invades. You march with the Scottish host to meet the English at Dunbar in April 1296. The battle is a disaster. The Scots are routed, and John flees north. Within weeks, Edward forces him to abdicate, stripping the royal arms from his surcoat in a humiliating public ceremony. The once-crowned king is taken to the Tower of London, then eventually exiled to France. You see him years later in Picardy, living quietly on his estates, far from the stone halls and damp mists of Scotland. He walks the gardens with a limp, his gaze often fixed on the horizon, as though watching a country he will never see again. When word reaches him of William Wallace's uprising, and later of Robert the Bruce's coronation, John makes no move to return. By the time he dies in 1314, the same year as the Scottish victory at Bannockburn, he is little more than a footnote in the war for independence. He once had the chance to lead. As you leave the quiet French estate where he spent his final days, the rain begins again, light but persistent. You think about how a king can lose not just his crown, but the faith of his people, when the hand that placed the crown on his head also holds the leash around his neck. The summer air over Naples hums with heat, the sky so bright it seems to bleach the colour from the sea. From the harbour, you can see the spires of churches rising over the crowded streets, and above them all, Castel Nuovo looms like a clenched fist. Inside, King Ferdinand I of Naples Ferrante, to his friends and enemies alike, sits in council, his expression calm, almost genial. It's a face that can pivot from charm to menace in the span of a sentence. Ferdinand inherited the throne in 1458 as the illegitimate son of Alfonso V of Aragon, a mainstream historical fact. Though his right to rule was recognized by the Pope, many Neapolitan nobles opposed him from the start, rallying around rival claimants from the House of Anjou. Within a year of his coronation, rebellion was already brewing. You see him on horseback, leading his troops out of the city gates to meet the rebel forces. His armor gleams, but it's not just steel that wins him the day, it's patience. Ferdinand bides his time, offers pardons, and lures rebel leaders back into the fold. Then, when their guard is down, he arrests them. Some are executed outright. Others are invited to a grand banquet under the guise of reconciliation. At the feast's end, they are seized and imprisoned, some for years, some forever. Historians still argue whether this calculated cruelty was a necessary act of statecraft or a mark of personal vindictiveness. In Naples, it becomes legend. Ferrante's justice is not swift but certain, and it often comes with wine and music before the blow. A quirky tidbit from the palace workshops. Ferdinand kept an elaborate garden of wax figures modelled after his executed enemies, posed in lifelike scenes. Visitors whispered that he used it as a private gallery of triumph, a place to contemplate the fates of those who had crossed him. Over time, his rule stabilizes, and Naples prospers as a centre of trade and Renaissance culture. Ferrante patronizes scholars and artists, funds new fortifications, and strengthens the navy. Yet the memory of his treachery keeps the nobility cautious. They smile in his presence, but they never turn their backs. In the 1482, when the Ottoman Turks briefly occupy Otranto on the southern coast, Ferdinand rallies his forces and drives them out. The victory is real, and for a moment he is hailed as a defender of Christendom. But even this triumph cannot scrub away the fear his own people have of him. By the time Ferdinand dies in 1494, his son Alfonso II inherits a realm that is rich and militarily capable but politically brittle. The memory of the banquet arrests lingers, a reminder that in Naples, loyalty to the crown is as much about survival as devotion. As you walk down from Castel Nuovo toward the sunlit harbour, the gulls wheeling overhead, you think about how Ferdinand mastered the art of making peace feel like a trap. In his court, safety was never a guarantee, it was a wager, and the house always won. The late afternoon sun drapes Cyprus in a wash of gold, the air warm with the scent of citrus groves and the faint brine of the Levantine Sea. In the harbour of Famagusta, ships from Venice, Genoa and Alexandria crowd the quays, their sails snapping in the breeze. Above the bustle, the Lusignan royal banner stirs lazily atop the citadel. Inside its thick limestone walls, Peter II of Cyprus sits on a carved chair, the weight of a crown that no longer commands respect, pressing hard on his brow. Peter inherited the throne in 1369 as a child, after the violent assassination of his father, Peter I, a murder committed by discontented nobles in the very palace where the boy now rules. A mainstream historical fact, the Lusignan kingdom of Cyprus was already in decline, dependent on shifting alliances with Venice and Genoa, vulnerable to both Mamluk power from Egypt and the commercial whims of Italian merchants. You see Peter now in his audience hall, pale and reserved, his tone hesitant as he receives envoys from Venice. They demand repayment for debts incurred during the reign of his regents, along with expanded trading privileges in Cypriot ports. Peter nods, offering concessions before the discussion grows tense. His council shifts uncomfortably. Each concession cuts a little deeper into what remains of the island's sovereignty. Historians still argue whether Peter was simply too inexperienced to resist foreign influence, or whether the kingdom's weakness left him with no real choice. Either way, his reign is marked by the steady erosion of Cypriot independence. A quirky tidbit recorded by travellers: Peter was known for his love of falconry, keeping trained birds not only for hunting but as diplomatic gifts. When Venetian envoys arrived, he would sometimes release a falcon in the courtyard mid-meeting, as if to break the tension or distract from uncomfortable demands. The final blow to his rule comes in 1373, when tensions between Venice and Genoa ignite into open war. Cyprus becomes a battlefield for the two maritime powers. Genoese forces, with help from disaffected Cypriot nobles, sack Famagusta and take Peter prisoner. You are there in the smoky aftermath, the air filled with the acrid tang of burning warehouses, watching Genoese banners replace the Lusignan standard over the harbour. Peter spends his remaining years under Genoese control, more a symbol than a sovereign. Even when he is nominally restored, his power is hollow. The trade concessions granted to his captors keep Cyprus dependent, and the kingdom drifts into the role of a minor pawn in the politics of the eastern Mediterranean. When Peter dies in 1382, the island is quieter but poorer, its ports still busy but under foreign eyes, its crown passed on with more ceremony than authority. In the narrow streets of Nicosia, merchants go about their business as if nothing has changed because for them, under one ruler or another, little ever does. As you walk away from the harbour, the gulls wheeling overhead, the sunset deepening into amber, you think about how Peter II's reign ended not with a decisive battle or a glorious stand, but with the slow, inevitable surrender of a kingdom to forces it could not match. The crown remained, but the kingdom had already been sold to the tides. The torches are dimming now, my friend, and the clamour of 30 reigns fades into the hush of night. We have walked through banquet halls and battlefields, through palaces heavy with incense and chambers heavy with fear. We have seen crowns placed on trembling brows and crowns toppled into the dust. Some kings were cruel by design, others by accident. Some failed because they overreached, others because they did not reach far enough. You might remember the gleam in King John's eye as he plotted another tax, or the cold calculation of Philip IV counting the Templars' gold. Perhaps the image of Charles VI, convinced he was made of glass, still lingers. Or maybe it's the banquet arrests of Ferdinand I that you can't quite shake, the way music and laughter could turn to chains in the span of a toast. There is a lesson in each reign, though it may whisper rather than shout, that power without trust rots from within, that fear can hold a throne only so long as the hand that wields it remains steady, and that a crown is lighter than it looks when you are winning, heavier than stone when you are losing. Now the halls are empty. The banners we saw unfurl in triumph hang limp in the still air. Outside, the streets of history lie quiet under a moonlit sky, their cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, kings, rebels, envoys, and ordinary souls like us, passing through. So breathe deeply. Let the noise of their intrigues and battles fade, and picture only the soft flicker of a single candle in a quiet room. Its light is enough to hold back the dark, for tonight at least. And with that, my friend, we close the book. Sweet dreams.